introduce Professor Antonio Celani. He is a professor in the International Center of Theoretical Physics, or ICTP. He's also affiliated with the University of Dresden, CISA. He's also in Trieste, Italy. So Dr. Celani received his PhD at Politecnico di Torino, Italy in 1998. And he joined ICTP in 2014 to contribute to the establishment of, fun fact, ICTP has also a quantitative life science section, where he's currently the head of. And back in the days, he was one of my professors in the program. Professor Celani's work spans many areas, but mainly focuses on the theory of reinforcement learning and its application to physics and biology, with recent interest in understanding animal behavior. Now, let us welcome Dr. Antonio Celani for his talk on decision-making theory in animals. Professor, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Fritz, for the kind introduction, and thank you very much, dear cousins of QLS, for having me as a guest for your seminar series. As Fritz said, since I'm at ICTP in the last 10, 12 years, I've been focusing my attention on problems concerning behavior, animal behavior, machine behavior, and reinforcement learning. So, as you probably may know, let's see if I can change. No, I can't. Okay, yes. Decision making is everywhere in biology. Even single-celled organisms like bacteria make decisions. So they measure the presence of chemicals in their surroundings, and based on that, they change their internal biochemical state in order to actuate motors, which in turn make flagella turn, and therefore they can, to some extent, decide in which direction to go in order to look for greener pastures or to avoid chemicals that could be harmful for them. Eukaryotic cells, of course, can do much more of this. They can sense a very wide array of chemicals, and then they decide about their cell fate depending on the presence of growth factors, on the presence of neighboring cells, etc. Even plants make decisions. They can do extremely complicated, complex calculations about the time when it's good to germinate, depending on external conditions, or whether to store energies in form of starch or using it, etc. So as you can already see from these examples, you don't need a brain to make decisions. You just need an array of sensors which are good enough, and some internal processing biochemical hardware that will translate the information that you receive from the environment into decisions. Of course, having a brain may help, and there are several instances of decision-making also, ranging from insects, which, as we will see in detail, can perform exquisite decision-making tasks shaped by their evolutionary needs. And of course, rodents are very good at making decisions around, as often as good as we are in certain tasks. And then you can have beautiful examples in what birds can do in a continuous decision-making task about what to do, where to fly, how to flap their wings, for what and for how long, etc. In migration tasks, in predatory tasks, etc. So I've always been very much interested in this kind of behaviors, and this was always my first source of inspiration to look into real animal behaviors. And of course, humans make decisions too. Some decisions are more mundane and hardly require a brain, like shopping in a grocery. But some others, of course, are life-changing decisions, and therefore understanding how these processes work, how decision processes work, is also fundamental for many biomedical applications. So what do I mean when I say decoding behavior? So there are essentially two questions that arise when you observe a certain kind of behavior. The first question is, why have certain decisions been made? So what was the intent? What was the goal of this behavior? Not all behaviors are goal-directed, but many are. And when they are, it's natural to ask the question, given a goal, what is the best way to act? What are the sequences of decisions that are the best, or try to approximate the optimal process of decision making? So this is essentially a problem in mathematical terms of problem of optimization. Optimization, which is dynamic, so it's not almost never a static problem. It's something where decisions always have to be updated as new information comes in. And the field of reinforcement learning probably is the largest domain which addresses all these questions of optimizing decision-making from classical optimal control theory, which can be seen as a subset of the full reinforcement learning problem, to recent developments which are very much data-driven. And then there is a second question that also arises, and it is, how are decisions made? So when we observe a behavior, we might ask, how is the information received by the agent processed? So what are the calculations that are taking place inside of the brain, or inside the cell, or inside the plant, that lead to a specific sequence of actions to be executed? And the mathematical tools that one can use to answer this second question is the tools which come from inference. So observing behavioral data and try to infer back what kind of calculations have been performed in the brain. So today, my talk will be in two parts. In the first part, I will give an example of a problem which we tackled with the idea in mind of looking for optimized behaviors. And in the second part, I will discuss the inverse problem, if you wish, that is to how to recover the decision-making process from experimental data. So, but in order to do so, we need to, first of all, to frame all these very different problems, from bacteria to humans, with a common mathematical language. So, as you know, famously, Galileo said that mathematics is the language in which the universe is written, and a dialect of this language is the theory of decision-making processes, which is the proper, gives us the proper semantic to discuss about behavior and to formulate our problems in a clear-cut way. So the key idea in this formalization is that actually we shouldn't fixate too much on the specifics of the organism that is performing this particular behavior, that is undertaking this decision process. All these instances, insects, rodents, birds, humans, cells, or plants, are just somehow the shadows of a more general idea, okay? And if we look at them just as separate instances, we might lose the underlying idea, and sort of we should become the philosopher, which, like Plato said, looks at the real essence of the problem. And the real essence of the problem is that the notion of an agent. So this is a mathematical notion that I will make clear shortly. And an agent is a conceptual object that is able to encompass all these different sorts of decision-making problems, which of course at some point you will have to adapt this notion of an agent to different cases, but it's important to develop a more general language, which includes, by the way, I'm not mentioning them, also machines and algorithms in general. So the key idea is that any of these processes, decision-making process, can be viewed as a repeated interaction between an agent and its surrounding environment. The agents takes actions, makes decisions. These, for instance, are labeled just like arrows that you might have in a joystick, okay? So just so you can go left, go right, go up, or stop. And these actions have an influence on the environment. The environment can also change by its own accord, but the idea is that there is this action and there is this feedback, or there is anyway this emission of observations from the environment to the agent. And this repeats cyclically. And this is the essence of the decision-making process. In the following, we'll go into more precise and technical details, but this is the key message for the moment. So rather than presenting you the mathematics of all this straight away, we will start with an example. So I will first focus the first part of my talk on how to optimize decisions in a specific example. And the results that you will see in this segment I've been obtaining together with Kyrell, who is one of the remote attendees, and with Emanuele Panizzone, a former postdoc in my group. The problem that we want to tackle is an old problem, is a problem of how moths, when they metamorphose and from being caterpillars turn into beautiful flying insects, how do they locate, especially male moths, how do they locate the presence of a female and then start the process that leads to mating. So it was discovered at the beginning, actually exactly 100 years ago, reported by Jean-Henri Fabre, who was an entomologist, that it was the first to observe this behavior of moths that were attracted by the presence of a female. And the first also to formulate the hypothesis that the communication between female and male was mediated by some volatile chemical. It took almost 50 years for chemists to discover which was this actually this chemical signal. Now we know that these are the sex pheromones, which are very short, very volatile molecules, which are specific to a certain species and sometimes even to a certain subclass of members of a certain species. So how does this communication work? You should imagine that the female is somewhere sitting on a branch of a tree. The males can be at hundreds of meters of distance. So there are experiments which show that male moths are sensitive to very, very tiny amounts of pheromone molecules. Down to 10 molecules in a liter are enough to elicit a cardiac heartbeat change in reaction to the stimuli. So they have these very, very exquisite sensors, which are the moth's antennae, which are nothing but an array of tens of thousands of olfactory receptor neurons, which are able to act essentially as a molecular sieve and capture every molecule of pheromone that is almost every molecule of pheromone that is around, and initiate a transduction pathway that then goes up in the brain and eventually elicits a response. So when this male moth, which could be, like I said, hundreds of meters away from the female, receives this signal, it's alerted. So this signal is, like I said, is a very specific chemical signal. So the chemistry of the signal, so what molecule it is, only conveys a qualitative signal, that is, I am a female of species X and Y, okay? It does not convey per se any information about the location of where it is. So this message actually is constructed by the transport of the signal itself, in the sense that in order to travel these hundreds of meters away from the female, this odor must be transported by the wind. And If the wind is strong enough, which means a few tens of centimeters per second, it means that it's also turbulent. So if you want to transport another signal far away from the source, almost invariably, this will be carried by a turbulent flow. And the presence of this turbulent flow means that the turbulence will mix pockets of fresh air together with pockets of water which contain a relatively high concentration. So that eventually the signal that arrives at the male is mangled. But it's exactly in this distortion of the signal that is hidden the information about where the source is. So if a moth is sitting somewhere at a point at hundreds of meters from the source, it will receive bursts of odor, whiffs of odors, which are interspersed by long periods in which there is no signal at all. And there is something in these statistics of time intervals, concentrations of odors that is received at the male's antenna that allows the male to somehow perform some computation and decide in which direction it wants to fly. And the behavior of moths has been recorded in the wild. For instance, okay, so let me finish here. The male moth receives the signal, decodes it somehow, and then takes some path to approach the female. I should say that this is a process that has been strongly under evolutionary pressure, because there is a scramble competition between males to reach the females. When they reach the female, they also have to start a very complicated nuptial behavior, but this is beyond our interest for today. So that said, this is what can be observed as a typical behavior of a moth. So this is a beautiful experiment which was done now more than 30 years ago. So they marked the male moths by painting a pink fluorescent paint on their back, and then releasing them at 20 to 25 meters away from a female. So the female was placed here, the male was initially placed here. Wind is blowing in this direction from left to right in the screen, as noted here. And then the experimenters were sitting on a tower 30 meters high, looking down at this stretch of land with a VHS camera, okay, something which I remember, but maybe many of you have never heard about, taking videotapes of this and then manually tracking the trajectories of the moths. And they were able to collect a data set of about a dozen of these flights. But they were also able to identify some specific behavioral patterns. That is the fact that there was an alternance of crosswind motions and then upwind surges, crosswind motion, etc., which they ascribed to the presence of encounters with the odor plume. So you should imagine that the female is here, she emits some odor concentration around. This is very fragmented, and whenever a male encounters the odor, then it goes upwind, and when it loses contact, it tends to go crosswind. So this was sort of the kind of explanation that they gave to this kind of behavior. And then there were experiments in the laboratory, which, however, at a much smaller scale, just a couple of meters, were somehow able to recapitulate this kind of behavior. So this is a typical situation when you observe behavior. So maybe you set up an experiment, you see, and you have experimental data that describe this behavior. So what do you do with that? How do you translate this into the mathematical language of decision processes? So in order to do so, now we have to enter a little bit into the mathematics of this, but it's going to be quite straightforward. So the key ingredient here is this notion of what is called the partially observable Markov decision process. So what is it? So the main idea is that we can partition the world into compartments. One of these is the agent, okay, that we discussed earlier. The outside part is the environment, and then there is an interface which separates the agent and the environment, which is called the sensory motor interface. And that's where there is this exchange of information received and decisions made. So notably, just to make an example, at any given point in time, at any given instant in time, the environment, which is characterized by some possibly very, very large dimensional state variable, which we call ST, somehow emits some observations. And in response to this observation, which arrives at the sensors of the agent in combination with its own internal state, which is another variable which describes what happens inside the agent, inside its brain, for instance, if it's an insect. Together with this, they determine some action, okay? So these orange arrows describe the process by which the combination of the internal state and the current observation lead to a decision. As a result of this decision, then the environment might evolve into a different state because of the decision or independently of that, or a combination of the two. And then at the same time, the agent takes stock of what it has just done and what it has previously observed and updates its internal state. So these are the key ingredients and transitions that are at play. Of course, this is a very abstract setting, but purposefully so, because it's made to be able to cover a wide range of possible behavior and decision-making processes. I should note that this is not the only way in which you could arrange arrows in this diagram, and later on we will see different ways in which actions precede observations. So all these kind of different diagrams, which are all essentially Bayesian causal diagrams, can have slight differences, but the essence remains the same. So the key idea is that once we have defined these quantities, at least at an abstract level, then we formulate an objective. And this objective is formulated as a long-term objective. So the agent wants to find controls, so wants to optimize over its controls and perhaps also optimize over its computations. So this part here in gray that you see, should be green, but it's gray, I don't know why. It's what are the computations that the agent does. So how it processes the information and builds up a new state. So the objective of the agent is to minimize, for instance, a cumulative sum of costs. Okay, so at every time step, it incurs a cost, and then it wants to somehow plan or find a strategy which, in the long term, will minimize the cumulative cost on average, because everything can be stochastic in this general setting. All right, so this is the general picture. In our specific case, we have to give specific meanings to all these abstract quantities. So what are they for instance, in our search or factory search task, or maybe in more general navigation and foraging tasks? So for instance, when we say the state of the environment, this is a combination of things like where the agent is in space, what is its posture, where are the targets, where are the resources to be foraged, what are the signals, the odors that arrive at the moth's antenna, etc. And the observations are actually what is measured by the agent itself, the detection themselves, maybe the direction of the wind, or any visual cue. Okay, so I'm listing possible choices for these variables S and Y. And when we think about actions, we think about, for instance, changing the direction of flight, increasing the speed, reducing the speed, maneuvering, so bending on one side or another. So these are the kind of things that we will call actions in this case. And in a search problem, for instance, the objective is to minimize the cumulative time to get to the target. Okay, so finding somehow the shortest path given the ability that the agent has to observe the environment, which is limited. Or for foraging would be collect the largest amount of resources, and you can formulate very different tasks. But the key important thing here that I want to discuss, we got, I don't know what I did, okay, is about how to choose the internal state, okay, or also called the memory. So how do we describe the agent? How do we describe the substrate that does the computation? There can be several kinds of choices. For instance, in a navigation task, you might think that the brain somehow is encoding for a map of space, and therefore every measurement contributes to building an update in this map in a navigation task or in a search task. There could be a clock, for instance, measuring how much time has elapsed between two consecutive encounters with the other. This might be a useful way to process the information. Or we can think about this internal state even in more abstract terms, like the full neural state of the agent, or even in more abstract representations, some abstract vectors which encodes for all the previous interactions that the agent has had with the environment. All these things are possible. So now I will give you a few examples of practical ways to describe these internal states and where do they lead. So the first one stands a little bit on its own because it's the case when you have a perfect memory. So when every time that you update your internal state, actually you're not throwing out any information. You have a perfect recording. Often, rather than having this in the form of a long journal of all the things that have happened in the past. So I took action, a certain action, moved in a certain direction, and therefore I observed this, the presence of another, etc., like a very, very long string of these occurrences. This is often encoded into a more compact object, which is called the belief. And it's a probability distribution about which is the state of the environment. In the case of navigation tasks, this belief takes exactly the form of a probability map. It's a map of where the agent thinks at any given time that the source is located. In this case, the update, so the computation, is a purely Bayesian update. So again, we don't know if this happens for real in the brain of an insect, but also not even in the case of the brain of a mammal. However, this is somehow the reference in the sense that it's an optimal memory that doesn't throw away any information. So just to show you how it works in practice is that, for instance, here you can see trajectories of artificial agents. So these are mimicking the moth behavior on a lattice. The moth has started in this point where it has encountered the other for the first time. So this blue bullet is the position where the first other encounter has been made. Then it has taken a sequence of actions, okay? And so at this particular time 10, it is in the location marked by the red square. And this shaded area is the probability map. So at this particular time, this sequence of Bayesian updates has produced the map. And this map, where it's darker, means that there's a higher probability that the source is there. And based on this probability map, then the agent makes the next decision. So this is where this policy, this decision-making happens. According to some rules that I'm not expanding on it, it's possible to compute approximately optimal strategies for this class of Bayesian decision-making processes, but there are also very good heuristic strategies that can work in this case. But we don't have time to go there. In this case, for instance, is a situation where there are repeated other encounters. You see there's another one here, and then if you go a long time, there are more here. So the agent moves more or less in a straight line, except for some zigzagging that you can observe here. This is a behavioral pattern that is actually observed in experiments when the other concentration is high enough. what happens if the auto concentration is lower and the encounters are more sparse? Then in this particular setting, you see that the agent starts doing some cross-casting. Okay, so this is increasing size, and until it makes a turn and then goes back, okay, to cover perhaps regions of space that were not covered by the previous sweep, and therefore it needs to check this out, and then this goes on, and it will keep on moving like that until it makes another auto encounter, and then it will resume some more straight motion. So the first thing that came from this analysis was that this kind of model is able to reproduce, at least qualitatively, the same behavioral pattern that we observe in behavior. So this could be a good way to explain what kind of computations are made in the brain. It's a good way, but it's also hard to argue that it's a biologically plausible representation of the internal memory. So researchers also looked into different ways to parameterize this internal state of the agent. And one rather obvious choice is to model the agent as a recurrent neural network. A recurrent neural network is a computational device which has exactly the same structure that we're talking about. So something where there is an internal state. Now, in the literature of recurrent neural networks, of course, the names are different. So this internal state C and H correspond to what was M in the previous slide. The actions, which are outputs, were the previous A, and the observations now have changed name too. But never mind. So this is the engine of a recurrent neural network. It's in this case, it's a so-called LSTM neural network. So there are lots of gates which process the information. Every one of these objects can be a rather high-dimensional quantity, and all these arrows here contain internal parameters. So this memory still is a relatively large dimensional object. So you can train a recurrent neural network in order to optimize a certain behavior. For instance, optimize the time to reach the source in a turbulent-like environment, like in the previous case. It's computationally very hard, but it's possible to do it, of course. The kind of results that you find in this paper, for instance, is that the kind of behavior is sort of similar to what you observe, in the sense that there are these off-plume behaviors which vaguely resembles crosswind casts, and there are more straight up trajectories when the agent is in contact with the plume. One difficulty of these complex memory or internal state models is that they have plenty of parameters. So if you want to understand what is happening inside this recurrent neural network, you have to do some heavy dimensionality reduction. So eventually this process will boil down to project somehow all these weights or all the activities of the neurons into a low-dimensional space. In this case, it's a three-dimensional space, and try to isolate some patterns of behavior that you can connect, okay? So this is certainly interesting from the viewpoint of neuroscience, because you could try to bridge these findings to actual neural states in the brain. But on the other hand, it seems like a big waste of resources, because you have to build a very huge model first and then compress it into a few degrees of freedom eventually. So this kind of considerations motivated us to look into minimal models for the internal states, okay? So I will give you a very, very quick introduction to what they are. They are known in the literature now for years as finite state controllers. The idea is that there are few countable internal memory states. So this clearly is a strongly reduced version of what happens in the brain, and somehow aims at capturing some coarse-grained degrees of freedom that can happen. Or, if you want, they could be thought of as equivalent to attractor states in the brain, which is a much more compelling analogy with what we know. But for us now, they are just abstract states. You can think of them as a a mood of the agent or an internal state, which largely describes what it thinks, in which situation it thinks it is. So here, for instance, in this case, there are 3 internal states labeled by colors. There are 2 observations if the agent is in contact with the other, if it without contact with the other. And then from one state to the next, this will produce an action, a decision. So move upwind, move crosswind, move downwind. And this will also update the new internal state. So the process by which you go from here to here is essentially what the agent does. It summarizes the decision process and the computation process. And then with this particular model, which as we will see, we can represent as a graph, as a simple graph, we can optimize all these parameters that govern this transition in order to minimize the expected search time. So we put this model of an agent into our virtual environment and then see how it performs. And to give you an example, without going too much into the details, so this is how such an agent, which has been optimized, how it behaves. You see that here in black, you see the other encounters. The color is the state in which the agent is in. And you see that it exhibits a variety of behaviors. Some of them resemble straight upwind flight. Some of them resemble casting crosswind, and some others are more complex. So when you look at what is the structure of the controller that optimizes this task, you will see that it's extremely simple. Okay, so at the beginning, we start with a controller which can have all sorts of possible actions taken, all sorts of possible transition allowed. So there will be plenty of arrows with random weights. But after optimizing, many of these transitions disappear, and eventually you find a structure that is pretty easy to interpret. If the agent starts in this green state, it will be preferably it will go up. Okay, actually it will always go upwind. If it doesn't have contact with the other, it will stay in this on green state. If it has contact with the other, definitely it stays there, but there is a small probability that it transitions from the green state to the blue state if it does no contact with the other. So after a while, as you can also see from here, the agent leaves the green state and transitions to the blue state. In the blue state, it performs something like a backward random walk. It's a random walk in all 4 directions. Actions are taken more or less at random, but with a slight bias backwards. You can interpret this as a first attempt to recover contact with the plume, with the other. It's sort of a first search strategy. But if the system persists in the state in which it doesn't contact the other, then it moves into the red state and starts alternating between the red and the yellow state. So you can think that now the agent has sort of gone in full panic mode. I totally lost control about where my plume is. And then I will start a crosswind motion that somehow will help me out, and because I will have at some point to cross again the plume and regain contact with the plume itself. And if you ask yourself the questions, where in space are these states, internal states, active? You see that as a matter of fact, they act as coarse-grained maps of space. So for instance, the green state is almost always active in the wake of the source, where it's very likely to have observations. The blue state is at the boundary of the plume, and here in the back, whereas the yellow and red states are mostly active when the agent is far away from the plume. Okay, so all of this is the result of optimization. We just decided that we want to inquire what happens with 4 states and then let the optimization work, and this is what comes out. Of course, you can play with more states, less states, and you will, in this case, you will see that you can actually assemble different modules of this kind of behaviors to create even better controllers, or even worse controllers if you have less available states. Okay, So this was the first part of the talk, which I hope gave you a general idea about how to approach a complex decision-making task by formalizing it with in the framework of the theory of decision-making, and how to choose different agent models to perform this optimization. In the second part, I would like to tell you about this is very recent work, which is still unpublished. It was started at the time when Karel and Emanuele were in my group, but thanks to the great work of this postdoc Giorgio, he really developed a whole tool, a whole series of tools that allowed us to break this problem. So the real credit goes to him more than me. So the key question now here is to ask about the how. So how do we infer what are the calculations inside the agent's brain or whatever engine decides from experimental behavioral data. So the key idea now is the following. Again, we have this interaction between the agent and the environment. And now the question, again, this is the same structure as before with slightly different positioning of the arrows, but this really doesn't matter. There's still a decision process here, and there is a computation here. The key question is, if we are given a data set of interactions between agent and environment, so a string of actions and observations, many of them in time, a whole bunch of them, can we just from this data understand what is the controller that enacts this behavior? And in particular, here we will focus on finite state controllers, so on specific minimal models of the agent behavior. Of course, this kind of question of inference has a very specific mathematical interpretation. In a sense, we want to somehow minimize the distance, or better, the divergence between the empirical distribution of the data, which we can get from our time series, and the prediction of a certain model. So this model will have certain parameters, so we want to minimize over the parameters a certain expectation of a divergence between data and the model. This is nothing but the usual approach to maximum likelihood estimators. Okay, it's just in a different language. And the specific structure of the finite state controller allows us to write the probability of the model in a relatively compact way, which is just essentially a product of matrices, which is also very efficient for computations. Okay, so in order to get a sense of what we want to do in practice, I would like to play with you a game. So now it's going to be a bit difficult on a remote talk to do this, but let me try. So I'm going to show you now a sequence of images, okay? And after this sequence of images, I will ask you to make a decision. And then I will ask a few of you what kind of decisions they made, and then we're going to reason about that. Okay, so you're ready? I'm going to show this short video. Okay, so question, Fritz, are you here? Are you there?
Yep, still here.
Okay, so give me an answer, right or left?
Right.
Okay, why? Why do you think you chose right? What's your understanding of your process that led you to this choice?
Well, at least from the start that I was able to saw the video, it mostly points to the right side of the screen.
Exactly. So this is one possible way. So the kind of computation that Fritz did was the majority of arrows was on the right. But there could be different ways. So has anyone sort of thought otherwise? Other choices could be, I don't know, the last arrow was to the right, so I picked right, or was to the left. So there are many, many possible ways in which you can do a computation. All of them are plausible agents. are ways to convert a sequence of observations into some decision. In this particular case, there is just a observation first and then a decision at the end, but there could be more complicated situations, okay? So let me ask now another question to Fritz and to all of you, at least to all of you that sort of think that they have somehow evaluated which was the majority of left and right. So do you think that you were counting how many of them were on the left or how many on the right, Fritz?
Well, I didn't really count. It's kind of more like it's kind of like replaying on my mind, like what is like the motive of the patterns. So like when I replay it in my mind, it's like mostly like going to like on the right direction. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's how I.
Okay, so we don't have a clear perception of what our brain is doing. So sort of come to the answer that we have an intuition that the majority is on the right. And it's true because there were 24 right arrows and 16 left arrows. Each one of those was spaced 50 milliseconds in time. So this is something that is a typical neuroscience task that is administered. And when you look at the data for humans, what you see actually is that for this kind of visual data sets, even if you're not aware, the brain is almost perfectly counting, because it's off just by maybe 2 or 3 different arrows in either direction. So it's actually there's something happening in our brain that we don't really are aware of, but which performs counting almost perfectly in this particular kind of sets. If I gave you another task, which is very similar, so rather than giving you visual images like arrows, maybe I gave you clicks, sort of like this kind of thing. Of course, you cannot distinguish in which direction they come because there's no stereo audio here available. This is a more complex task for some reason, because there are other processes in our brain that occur. And the way that we respond to this is much less sharp. Actually, we need at least a difference of about 10, an imbalance of about 10 on one side or the other in order to be able to discriminate correctly whether there were more clicks or pulses on the right and on the left. So these kind of experiments are ideal to test our inference approach. So that's what we did. We did this with the rat data. So these kind of tasks are called evidence accumulation tasks. So in sense, because there's an idea that the agent or the rat is integrating this information in time and then eventually coming to a decision. So the task in rats works exactly as you would expect. The rat is fixed in the middle here. The task starts. Then there are clicks on the left and clicks on the right. And at a certain time, which is decided by the experimenter, the task is the information accumulation is stopped. Sorry, I can't really get a hand on this. The information is stopped. The rat is released, and then it can move either to the right port or to the left port. It will receive water on the side which has had more clicks. Clicks are random, so it's something very similar to what you have observed in your experiment. So we have this experimental series of data in which there are actions which can be listen. So there'll be instant of time where there is no noise at all. There are instants of time where there is a click to the left, a click to the right. So there is this long string of listenings. This corresponds to left, no sound, right, left, no sound, etc. And at the end, there is this end signal, which in the experiment is a flashing light. The rat is released, and then it takes the action go right in this case. Okay, so we have this experimental data set, and we want to put it inside our inference machine, which is, I can tell you a bit later if there's time, is nothing but a very complex global optimizer that tries to find the largest value of the likelihood. and we see what happens. So, and we try with these finite state controllers of different sizes. For instance, when we try with the 2 internal states, it's not even shown because the likelihood is extremely bad. But with 4 internal states, we start seeing a very good level of likelihood. So these are the convergence curves for this. Interestingly, in this case, it's enough to have about 100 or few hundred trajectories, which are long, I don't know, maybe 1 second, 2 seconds at most. They are enough to infer correctly the behavior of the agent. So it's not particularly thirsty in terms of data because the model is very simple. So we see that when we get then to 6 internal states, then essentially the likelihood is saturated. There are just very, very minor gains on moving to larger sizes of the system. So if you then go back to the data and say, what is the prediction of these finite state controllers that we inferred? And you see that they overlap, all of them very, very nicely with the data. So all of them already have a very good predictive power. And this corresponds to very simple structure. For instance, if you have 4 internal states, the best fit is an internal controller that has 2 states, either red or green. It listens. For instance, in the green state, if it listens and it gets a left signal, it stays there. If it gets a right signal, it tends to stay there, but with a certain probability leaks to the other state, where a symmetric situation occurs. Okay, so this is a reminiscent of a situation in which these 2 states essentially express the level of confidence that the agent has about the fact that the majority of clicks is on the right or on the left. If there are signals that contrast this belief, then there is a probability of moving to the other side. Eventually, when the agent gets the signal end, it transitions to this other state with the probability 1, and then picks the corresponding action. Okay, so this model is able to do a very good fit in predicting the shape of these responses. Since the system model is very simple, you can actually make a further step. You can understand analytically how it behaves in the limit, where it's totally perfectly symmetric. And what you discover is that actually this finite state controllers is implementing just a counter with forgetting. So the probability of taking a certain action is made on the basis of a count, like in the perfect agent before, but there is also a forgetting rate, which is induced by these transitions to the opposite side, which is called epsilon here. And so you can exactly reproduce the data just by means of this iterative system, which adds counts to the left or to the right, and then forgets at a certain rate. And this fits very well the data with a very simple and interpretable model. Of course, if you see here, the 6 states is better in performance. So one might ask, what is it doing that it's performing an even better fit of the data? And when you look at its structures, what is happening is just that it has introduced in the middle a buffer state. So in order to go from this high confidence right to a high confidence left, now it has to go through an intermediate state, which expresses somehow a level of uncertainty about the situation. And this is also reflected by the fact that this intermediate yellowish state is as the maximum of occupation, where there is a perfect balance between left and right clicks. The presence of this intermediate state is acting as a buffer, and therefore enables the agent not to switch decisions too quickly. So it just, if there is some signal that is going in the opposite direction, the agent does not immediately change opinion, but still passes through this sort of waiting state before committing entirely to the new situation. Okay, so how am I doing with time? I'm afraid I'm running a bit late. How much time do you have?
Alex, Well, supposedly we're ending at the 2 minutes, but
Okay,
you mind if we can extend a bit?
I can cut short, okay, because
Thank you.
I just wanted to go through the second example, but this will also require some sort of interaction that is pretty difficult to do online. So I will just very briefly in 1 second tell you that there is another task that we can consider, and it's the problem of decision making in changing environment. So this is a task, experimental task done with mice. So mice can decide whether to put their snout in left or in a right port. Water is given with a certain probability, larger probability on one side, perhaps on the right side, with 80% probability and with 20% on the other side. So it's an uncertain environment, but it's also a switching environment because every now and then the good port and the bad port switch. And therefore they have to realize that the switch has happened and therefore change their behavior. And without going into the details, the flow is the same. We make fits. We look at how good they are in reproducing the data. And then we can find structures, increasingly complicated structures. In this case, they are all linear. So they are reminiscent of what happens in possibly in a linear attractor in the brain. The interpretation in this case is also pretty obvious. The terminal states, the red and green here, express confidence that the environment is in a certain state, best port to the right or best port to the left, whereas the middle ones act as switch detectors. So they come up when the agent realizes that there's been a switch in the environment. Okay, so take-home message, very, very quick. Finite state controllers, I hope I convinced you that even they're very simple, they are expressive enough to represent rather complex behaviors. They can be optimized and they can also be inferred from experimental data. Of course, more complex tasks, more complex situations require better tools, and this is still work that is under progress. So finally, very last slide. I'm closing with this because some of you may know, but some maybe don't. The engine that controls Super Mario game is a finite state controller with a sufficiently large number of states. So even rich behaviors like the ones of video games often have an inner engine that is eventually very, very, very simple. So with that, I'm done. Thank you for your patience.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Antonio, for that very interesting talk. I don't know if anybody has questions or if we have time for questions. How many questions can we accommodate, Alex?
I think we could take an additional 5 minutes. That's fine if there's questions.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions now? May raise your hand and put it in the chat, or you can just speak up.
Looks like Fred has a question from the room.
Go, Fred.
Yeah, it's not from the room, it's from me. Quick confirm. I was wondering, it was a really interesting talk. I was wondering in the changing environments, when you're optimizing, if there is some uncertainty in the position of your source or of the goal, making some mistakes, so a suboptimal decision can give opportunities to find unpredictable or unpredicted new outcomes, right? So you have some goal, but if you make mistakes, that mistake is an opportunity to find a new strategy or to adapt to a changing situation. Is that a thing in your methodology?
Yeah. So you're referring to the optimization case, right? So I'm going back to this one. Yeah. Okay. Yes. That's an excellent question. So when we optimize, typically we are trying to find the best trade-off between actions that go towards the source and actions that do not necessarily go towards the source, but are useful to collect information about the position of the source. So that's the general optimization task. Another part which I think I understand from the question is that, however, we might have an incorrect model of the environment, so that we don't know exactly where the source is. The source might be moving. That's also a possibility. So what do we do then in that case? This framework can be adapted to that case as well. What will happen is that there will be more. Typically, what we observe is that there are more random behaviors or more exploratory behaviors to accommodate for the fact that there is a continuous need to collect information. So the process of collecting information never ends. At some point here, you have seen, for instance, in these belief maps, that if you have enough information, they shrink. But if the source is moving, they also diffuse. So you always have this contrasting loss of information due to the fact that the source is moving of its own accord, and that the information that you acquire is shrinking the belief. So you have to sort of chase this moving target, and also keep on adding information to have a sense of where it is. Is that answering your?
Oh, yeah, thank you. Interesting.
Okay, just a minute, Andre, Chichen actually direct message me for his question. So after Chichen, we'll go to Andre. Chichen, can you
you hear me?
ask your question? Yeah,
Yeah,
perfect.
thank you, Professor Antonio, for your talk. So I'm curious about the inferring part, like when you have the data and you're trying to infer the controller, like how would you design the controller? Like why don't you is finite state machine sufficient? Like I know in automaton theory, like there's push down automaton like Turing machine. Like how would you choose to just focus on the finite control?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. So in this example that I'm showing you, what we did is that we just chose a certain number of nodes and then started with a blank slate. So everything was possible. Every transition was possible. So there was the most general kind of finite state controller that you could have. And then we run the inference and let the data select the structure of the finite state controller. You can enforce specific topologies, okay? So you can decide that given your knowledge about how the task is, or given a certain prior knowledge about how you think that the system should process the information and make computations, you could force a certain structure. For instance, you could force it to be a tree, in which case you have structures that are called behavioral trees. And if you force it to be a tree, of course, it's a strong bias in the sense that you're imposing a structure. But it's also a great reduction in complexity because you have less possible parameters to describe the system. So you, in the design of your controller, which could be very specific, okay, like the one you mentioned, or as general as possible, you have somehow to make to balance the requirement of having an efficient way to compute or to infer, and then expressive enough. Finite state controllers per se, they can reproduce any agent behavior, but this comes at the steep price of having a very large number of internal nodes, actually an exponentially large number of internal nodes. It's more or less like the usual universality theorem for neural networks. So you can do a lot with a shallow network, but you need lots and lots of nodes. One way to mitigate this complexity is, for instance, to use hierarchical structures. So you have controllers that act on subcontrollers, and this hierarchical structure is a way to balance the complexity with the expressivity. Did that answer your question?
Yes, thank you so much for the answer. I see.
Okay, for the last question, can we have Andre?
Yes, hi. That's great
Hi.
talk. Thank you. Do you think the memory parameter, like the discounting, range over the past. Is a quantity that's actually under the control of the animal, depending on the uncertainty of the environment, or is it just kind of always going for the maximal resources that its neurophysiology allows?
I tend to believe that it's an adaptive parameter that, depending on the context, can change. For instance, I can tell about the factory search problem. So, for instance, here I'm showing you a video in this particular environment, which is a relatively narrow plume. Okay, so the geometry of the problem is it's essentially a reed bone of odor that is fluctuating around. We actually, in our work, repeated the same analysis in a different environment. So the plume was larger, was more fragmented. What we found was a similar topology, but different probability rates, which were essentially expressing the fact that, for instance, the width of this cast behavior could change depending on geometry of the problem. So all these internal ways of essentially, these are memories again. These transition rates are a way of keeping memory of things. I think that they are adaptive. Maybe the topology is important and is key, and it's determined by the type of task. But the specific parameters, I think they are adapted to the specific properties of the task. Just like in the other tasks, as you correctly said, the timing between pulses, this might be something that determines the timescales of response in an adaptive way.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
Sure.
Okay. Thank you everyone for your questions. If you have more questions, you can email Dr. Celani for your inquiries for this stuff. And once again, we thank him for this great talk. Alex, you have any final words?
Thank you very much, Dr. Celani.
Thank you. Been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.